Okay, welcome to the GDPR session and Euro data session and data protection session and whatever you'd like to call it. In order to try and get some kind of scope on this, I've actually ended up getting the biggest number of panel you've ever seen in your life, but hopefully it will make sense as we go through it. So initially, I'm going to ask Rob to open it up from a digital point of view of GDPR, and I'm sure you've heard his sessions before, but it's a good starting point. And then Lara will follow that, and then we'll bring in Kevin from Scots Stowe, and I'll introduce everybody as they come through. But okay, Rob.
Thanks. Well, we'll just put that there. Am I just pressing anything in particular? I think there's a... To which one? Pressing that one? Yeah, great. Thanks for listening, and please don't shoot the messenger. I'm here to talk a little bit about GDPR. The reality is that it's still fluid. I looked this morning before I came down to see whether or not the ICO had published the much promised rules on consent, and they haven't. They promised it in June. A consent paper took place in March this year. There are over 300 responses apparently, and the ICO is saying at the moment it's going to take them some time to deal with it. So building a business under new rules is the theme of my session, but I'm just going to cover the first few slides just to introduce GDPR, as Mark said. So firstly, clearly I suspect you're all in this room, you all recognise the scope, and the scope is the data that you hold, and that needn't necessarily be just customers, so bear in mind suppliers, employees and so on. You are data controllers for a significant proportion of data in different guises. Secondly, it's updating the Data Protection Act of '98, which was when I first started my business, so I knew it and loved it when Elizabeth France brought it in then, and subsequently PECA in 2003, the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulation. So it's an update on those things. Now, what I will say on the next slide is it surprised me to know that a number of people didn't know what GDPR was. So that's for those people, just to explain, because I appreciate I've been living with it now for 2 years and living with it intensely for 12 months, as has the rest of the team, I suspect. But in reality, a lot of people still don't know about it. So it is a significant change. Now, as I said, don't shoot the messenger. So I will start with the big impacts to start with. And I will say, and Lara will cover off some of the legal issues after my session, but the first thing I will say is the ICO does tend to get confused between best practice and law. So I had a client last year who had contacted the ICO to say, I've got a problem with my email data, we've acquired it from lots of different places, I don't know what the consent levels are on it, what shall I do? And the ICO told them to stop marketing to it. As simple as that. So they came to us and obviously we worked through it. And there was a proportion of the data that they couldn't use, but in reality the majority of it was okay. So there is some reassurance in there. But the first thing is consent. So what they are saying, and as I say, don't shoot the messenger, explicit opt-in for all marketing on and offline. Now I hadn't appreciated that they were referring to offline as well, but as I say, Lara will pick up that in certain circumstances in the rules they are saying that if there is a higher legal precedent, then that can be utilised. So there is an issue. There are lawyers arguing with each other. I've experienced a couple of lawyers who disagree with each other about this. One saying 80% of legacy data will effectively be out of action next year, and the other is saying rubbish. So it is difficult to find the truth. Secondly, and this is important for me, perhaps less for you, but if you're involved in B2B, there is some definition now between business-to-business marketing, between incorporated businesses and unincorporated businesses. So unincorporated businesses, it looks like, and again they've not confirmed, that the unincorporated business will be regarded as personal data. So if you're dealing with sole traders partnerships, as I do a lot with tradesmen, the net result is that they could well be outside of the exemption for business data which exists in PECA, and we're still waiting and hoping that there will be an exemption for incorporated businesses, at least in the new rules. And then finally, the one that I think is the kind of hidden hit, if you like, for a lot of businesses is this subject access request. So I suspect that the ICO won't go through with this, and the word on the vine, as it were, is that they've realised that this is actually going to result in them getting a lot of work. So, because every complaint has to go back through them. So there might well be a backing off. But at the moment, of course, you can charge £10. That acts as effectively a deterrent from anybody saying, what do you know about me? But in future, they're suggesting that that's going to be free. It's got to be available digitally. It's got to be done within a month. And broadly speaking, and I'll mention it later on, what they're pointing towards is a significant use of a single customer view. Now, what do you know about me? Actually is an awful lot of information. So all of the bits and pieces of information that you've gathered from various places. Within retail, we worked with HMV, and they thought they'd only got a 2 million customer database, and when we looked hard, we found 11.2 million records. And that's because they hadn't taken into account customer services and various return functions, if somebody had refunded a product and captured the data at the till and so on. So lots and lots of bits of data need to be brought together. And one of the things that I've been living with for the last 20 years is quickly and effectively creating a single customer view, and which is what we needed to do for loyalty. And I suspect that there might well now be an opportunity for any of you that have been teetering on the brink of whether or not you get involved in loyalty and get involved in a significant single customer view. Now perhaps is the time. Moving on, so what does that then hit? And this is the other bit of bad news, is that some businesses are going to have to legislate specifically for data, and invariably it's public or bodies as such, or authorities and so on. Fines are going to be significantly more, so 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover, whichever the greater is the wording they've actually used in the document. So they are being very specific about that. And I find at the moment, and I mentioned it, that they are actually being a little bit more aggressive at the moment in their fines and the way they're going about things. And that's no bad thing in some respects, because it does sharpen everybody's interest. But in reality, I do think that it isn't safe out there. It isn't as easy as it was. Back in the day when I worked in the football pools industry, I would phone up the data protection registrar and say, I've got a problem, and they would say, let's work it out. And that clearly isn't the case now. Another little bit that needs to be incorporated in the scope is the outsourced businesses. So you will need to quote in your privacy policy who has got access to your data or their data, and how they're using it as part and parcel of that being more specific. So I have seen a couple of privacy policies that have been developed that have actually talked about the email providers, the data providers and so on. And clearly there's some requirement for you to get in touch with those people and make sure that those people are operating at that level. And I'm doing some work now for an outsourced business that needs to do exactly that for its clients. So processes need to be established to deal with failure. There's these things called well, as I refer to it, as disaster recovery, but data protection impact assessments. So in other words, if there is a risk, you should have thought through what that risk was and written down what you would then do to resolve it. So it's basically just being proactive. And data breaches technically, and I always find this a bit odd with the ICO currently, is that you seem to report a data breach and then you get fined. So the implication is that if you don't report, you don't get fined. Excuse me. But clearly there's a legal requirement going forward. So I'll finish now, and I've just finished on this chart, and I know we're going to do some round table sessions afterwards, but the reason I put this chart together is that in the last 12 months, having lived with GDPR so much, I've actually I've kind of got the ICOs thinking about it, and their principle is that they want to take people from being data aware to being data centric. So I've just kind of mapped out, what I would do in the circumstances and what we indeed do to get to that point. And as you say, I mentioned in phase 2, considering customer loyalty as part and parcel of building a single customer view. So utilising the changes in the laws to enhance and build something that maybe you don't have now. But the first phase is just all about audit, all about inspection, understanding what's going on. So, okay, so that hopefully has introduced an interesting topic. Not.
Very good. We're going to play a bit of musical chairs now. And so, whilst we change over to Lara's slide there, so I thought, obviously, from Rob's situation, it's very much digital, looking at how you'd reuse data, etc., and the GDPR implications. Lara, of course, from Abacus' point of view, we've got a requirement for what we do with our data as her customers, so that she can continue giving us the names and data for the future. And so let me pass you over to her now. Okay, sorry. Well organised, of course. Yeah, that was my chance. Getting 7 panel.
Is it not there?
Do you have it?
I don't have it.
You still there?
I can talk though.
Yes, Dick. Oh, over Dick.
Yeah.
It's on. Is it on? It's on there.
Yeah, I mean, not to worry, we don't necessarily need slides. I can talk you through anyway. Shall we start?
Why not?
Okay.
This is all.
Oh, that's it. There we go.
We're all right.
Right, I've got a clicker. Yes, right, we're ready to go. Well, yes, as Mark said, I'm Lara Bonney. I'm the UK Managing Director for Epsilon Abacus, and we help retail businesses such as yourselves to share data to help you target primarily catalogues. So I'm coming at this from the catalogue angle. And I think something to pick up on that Rob mentioned is that the thing to remember with GDPR is that what's most important is that you have compliance when you are planning to market to all consumers. It's not necessarily you need opt-in for all marketing channels to all marketing consumers. I think there's a lot of confusion out there, but we do need compliance across the board. But first of all, I thought let's step back a bit, because you know this can be very dry. Let's face it, it is legislation. So what is this all about? And the brass tacks of it is that, you know what, consumers really like catalogues. They like catalogues for all the reasons that all the research says. They're tactile, they can share it, they can keep it, it's been inspired by it. And multi-channel retailers love catalogues because you manage to make money through them. They give you a good return on your marketing spend. So there's a good relationship going on. And I think if you ask any of the legislators, and you also ask the ICO, are they trying to stop retailers sending catalogues to consumers? I don't think they'd say that was what they were trying to do. What they were trying to do is actually just to answer some questions that consumers have. We're all consumers, and I have to say sometimes I wonder, where's my data going, particularly online? Because you know, it just seems to go everywhere. And quite rightly, we've all got questions, and they just need addressing by the data industry. We just need to be clearer and more transparent. And consumers just want to have a bit more control, a bit more choice, a bit more trust, and they just want to be informed. That's what this new regulation is all about, not trying to make business difficult for us all in the room. So it was announced in 2012 actually that we're going to be changes to the regulation, so I've been dealing with this for 5 years. And in that time, I've tried to get as much opinion from all of the legal and data protection experts that I possibly can. So we work very closely with Robert Bond, who's a high-profile data protection lawyer that works for Bristow's. He's actually put together some guidance on how to get your consumer, how to be able to contact your consumers through direct mail going into the future. That is available for anybody. We work very closely with Rosemary Smith from Op4, Christine Andrews from DQM, James Milligan for the DMA. I'm on the board of the Data Protection Network, which is a whole host of industry experts that come together to talk about how does GDPR apply right across the board to everybody. And then because the Abacus Alliance is owned by a very wealthy American parent, Epsilon Conversant, they turn over $600 million a year, and they are not going to get this wrong. So we need to make sure that we also got access to very high-profile lawyers in the US as well. And I talk to the Chief Global Privacy Officer pretty much weekly on this subject. I think something you probably need to know is that actually there are 6 legal conditions that you can call upon when you're trying to engage with consumers. two of those legal practices are consent and legitimate business interest. Now, consent is just one method of actually being able to process data for marketing. And there is no hierarchy to the legal conditions. You can call upon whichever condition you feel is right for the type of marketing that you're doing. Legitimate interest is another. Now, if you're going the opt-in route, and you have to go opt-in route for anything that falls under the PECA regulation, so the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulation, if you're sending email or text or doing automated calls, that does require explicit consent. But if you're using mediums such as direct mail, which are supposedly a bit less intrusive, it's possible to call upon legitimate business interests and still continue using an opt-out mechanism that is current today under the Data Protection Act. So how can you do this? Well, it's because it's actually written in the regulation. So if you ask any lawyer, can we still opt out for direct mail, they can call upon this part of the regulation and they can use it in a court of law to say, yes, this is possible. The processing of personal data for direct marketing purposes may be regarded as carried out for legitimate interest. So you're probably wondering, what is legitimate interest? What that simply is that it's saying, right, me as a retailer, I have products and services that I would like you as a consumer to know that I sell. That is my interest in sending the marketing to you. And you as a consumer are interested in the products and services that I have because you might like to buy them. We are interested in this relationship. Therefore, let's assume that this relationship is a legitimate business one, and we will market to you unless you tell us that you don't want us to market to you. To be able to use this approach, it's not a get out of jail free card just to carry on using an opt-out box. You have to go through a balancing test to say that you've actually reviewed what type of marketing it is that you're going to send, and does that marketing that you're sending infringe that consumer's rights in any way? And if the balance of interest is not there, you can't send it. Now, the Data Protection Network has actually done quite a lot of work on legitimate interest and how it applies to business. They've actually put together guidance, which they have sent to the ICO, and the ICO, Elizabeth Denham has herself said that she has welcomed the guidance and that actually it's very sound, and that they believe that the ICO will adopt quite a lot of the guidance that the Data Protection Network has put together on behalf of the industry. So they have a template that you can go through to conduct this balancing test exercise. The main thing is, back to the whole reason why this is starting in the first place, you just need to be much clearer about what you're doing with data and why you would like to market to people. And as long as you give people a very clear way of opting out, and if they object to it, and then you act on that, you should be okay to do that. Now, I know a lot of people are saying, okay, yeah, that's fine, we know that applies to first-party mail, but what about third-party? Now, there are some voices in the industry that are saying, well, we're not really sure the legitimate interest applies to third-party direct mail. Again, we'll wait and see what the guidance says when the ICO publish the guidance on legitimate interest. But remember, there are different types of third-party data. Somebody's filling in a survey that's going to be sold on to anybody. That probably does need consent because the balance of interests is not really as much in the consumer favour. But if you're sharing the data within a cooperative environment that's a closed user group, that might be a bit more of a balance of interests. And we've asked so many different data protection experts and lawyers on this, and they're all saying the same thing. So Bristow's in this guidance that they have created have said that it is okay to call upon legitimate interest to use and share data. Opt4 created a preview version, so Rosemary Smith said the same thing. DQM and DMA have spoken at events saying exactly the same thing. They're on YouTube, videos that we can share with you if you want to see what they say. And of course the Data Protection Network have also put it in their legitimate interest guidance as a case study for the ICO to approve whether actually is a closed user group okay to call upon legitimate interest. So this is the type of statement that should now be at the point of data collection. And you do need to be able to give more information on what you're going to do with the data in a link. There is a video available for any multi-channel retailer that wants to add it to their permission statement that's specifically been designed for consumers. 90-second video that just says to the consumers, so if you share data, what's going to happen to it? What's the benefit to you for sharing it? So if anybody's interested in having that video available, anyone can have it, please let me know. Now it's a commercial decision you've all got to make, because you know what, you can choose consent to get permission from consumers to send your catalogue to, and you can choose legitimate interest because that's legal as well. There is quite a difference in the type of the amount of data you're likely to have available. So we did some research, commissioned OPT4 and DQM through Permission Max to do some research. Asked 750 nationally represented consumers what they thought. Now, we presented a whole series of permission statements, some opt-in, some opt-out, some friendly wording, some not, variations of, and this is what they said. So across the board, a friendly opt-out statement has 47% higher acceptance, so they're 47% more likely to say, that's okay, continue marketing to me, than a legally worded opt-out statement. As you can see, really high for men, even higher if you're marketing to the over 55s. So I'd think about these stats quite carefully when you're making your decision which route you would like to go. So those are the points that I'd like to make.
Okay, so we've had a digital, co-op look at and how data's in. So Will Wiggins have recently joined us at the DCA as our legal representatives, lawyers as such, and part of member benefits are we're going to try and introduce those guys to you as being a member of the DCA. So we thought we'd put their GDPR take on this, so you get a third point of view before I ask our friends over here a few more questions. So.
Thanks very much. That's brilliant. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Naylor. I'm a partner at Wiggin, which is a boutique full-service firm that specialises in media, tech and IP, and I lead the tech and privacy practices. The slides I'm about to show today, there are just three basically, will be pretty quick. They come from a much longer presentation which goes into things in more detail, and we will be running a session for DCA members at the end of June if people are interested on the 29th, and I think if that hasn't been mentioned yet, there'll probably be a message going around about it later, and if any of you can make it and would like to, we'd be very pleased to see you.
There's a leaflet outside.
Oh, fantastic, thank you. So I know that Rob very briefly spoke about key changes, so I won't go over the ones that he's already mentioned, but some others that we perceive as key changes are, one, the principle of accountability. Generally, you are going to need to keep a record of why you are processing data, for what purposes, and what you're doing with it. Rob mentioned the breach notification obligation. That turns the current regime on its head, where the default is that you typically don't have to notify unless there's a risk to a regime where you do have to notify, unless you're very confident that there isn't. There is now this obligation for data protection impact assessments, which Rob mentioned, an obligation on many of the companies here, which is likely to apply, which is the appointment of data protection officers. They need to be impartial and advise the business on how to ensure compliance, and there's a whole stack of roles within an organisation that cannot perform the DPO function. So for instance, CEOs, COOs, marketing officers cannot be the data protection officer. You need to have someone who doesn't have a conflict around ensuring compliance. There's a further principle of ensuring data protection by design and default, which means essentially everything that you do from the get-go needs to have data protection compliance built in. As Rob said, this is all about the move to being data-centric. Another provision which has not been spoken about in great detail, but which we think is going to be very significant, is data portability. There is a general obligation with some exemptions that will allow data subjects, all of the people that you process data on, to ask you to transfer the data that you hold on them to others, either to the data subject or, for that matter, to your competitors. And it needs to be in a machine-readable format. And that's obviously quite a significant provision. Now, although, as Lara said, there's kind of no hierarchy in terms of the legal grounds for processing, in terms of whether you go legitimate interests or whether you go down the consent route, there are implications of going down the consent route. So, for instance, the data portability obligation only applies in circumstances that include you having relied on consent. It doesn't apply where you've relied on legitimate interests. Data processors, these are now the companies that process data on your behalf, have liability, and you as a controller potentially have joint and several liability, which means that if your processors stuff up, you can still be held liable for their mistakes if they infringe. In terms of consent, the burden now in terms of getting consent is it's harder to get it, and as Rob mentioned, sanctions are more significant. I thought I'd talk very briefly about practical steps. So GDPR comes into force May the 25th, 2018. So things that your organisation should be thinking about doing now. First of all, appoint that data protection officer, or at least, even if the obligation doesn't bite, someone who is going to be responsible in the organisation for overseeing compliance. It's a sensible thing to do, particularly given the heightened activism of regulators. Conduct a data protection audit so that you understand within the organisation what you do with data, how you share it, where it goes, why you're doing that, so that you can have an understanding of where you are in terms of compliance now, where the gaps are and what you'll need to do ahead of GDPR to be compliant for when it's implemented. Identify where you rely on consent and work out on what grounds you think you have that consent and whether that passes muster under the GDPR regime, which goes to the legacy point. And also, for that matter, identify where you're relying on legitimate interests, because GDPR now requires a heightened level of transparency. So it's no longer fine in privacy policies just to say we're processing this because it's in our legitimate interests, full stop. You actually need to explain why you believe it's in your legitimate interests. You need to look at where data is going outside of the EU, because there are restrictions on transfer to anywhere that doesn't provide adequate safety and security for the rights and interests of data subjects. You need to look at where you need to do this data protection impact assessment. You also, it says here, document your processing. So this is the accountability principle, which means you need to keep a record and be able to show why your processing is compliant if the ICO investigates. And obviously it makes sense to look at your documentation, both in terms of internal policies and training, reviewing agreements with your data processors. Bear in mind, as I've said, you're potentially liable for their breaches, so you really need to make sure that contractually you're covered. And also that means that agreements that you have in place now with data processors may need refreshing. So this would go to people who are doing your data storage, your ECRM, fulfillment, all that sort of thing, as well as your privacy policy that tells your customers and users how you use their data. Last slide, very quickly. Brexit. Does Brexit mean you can ignore it? Well, because time is short, I'll just tell you that those 5 points mean no. Brexit doesn't mean you can ignore GDPR. I think any business in the room that thinks that they'll just wait and see what happens with Brexit would be making a mistake. Happy to expand on that, but I think best to move on now. That's it. Sure.
Okay, so all of that's very interesting, but practically what do we do? So I'd like to just ask Kevin Davis from Scotts and Stowe, who is going to have to try and change all those systems, become understanding of GDPR, and how do what do we do? What is it that we need to do to be able to meet the requirements of GDPR?
So I'm obviously conscious of time, but I think a few people have mentioned already, we don't know where consent's going to land yet. As Laura very elegantly puts it, compliance is a given.
Thank you. Compliance is a given, and the accountability is going to start falling on us as retailers to be able to prove that we have been compliant with this data capture. So whilst we're waiting for consent to be resolved, I don't want anybody to sit there not doing anything at the moment. A good example is we've already had to engage with our ERP vendor, our CRM system, about system changes to actually make things compliant. I've worked on a lot of order processing systems in the past. Most just contain a tick box to say, do not mail me. That's no longer going to be anywhere near enough to be able to carry the accountability you need to be able to prove compliance under GDPR, even without consent. I don't know whether or not somebody's not ticked an opt-in box from what I'm currently holding on my system. So definitely I would engage with whoever your systems providers are to make sure that ahead of time you've got that to where you can. I think we've quite already seen the steps we need to do from the very good slide we had a few minutes ago of things there, but we need to not underestimate the scale of system changes that are required here and the timelines around some of them, because we use an operating system that I'm sure many of you here also use, and the pace of change of some of these systems sometimes can take several months, even after deciding what you want to do, before you can roll out these changes. And May isn't actually very far away in the right terms of software development, so that's the biggest challenge I would say to act on today.
I'm conscious of time, and we haven't brought in Julian or Tim, but we are going to have some round table sessions where you can ask them questions in a minute. When Tim, where are you?
I think all about customers is interesting. I think it's the bit that we probably all have missed at the moment is the employee and the supply information. We went through a sale process last year, and with companies in the US, Canada, and Germany. Out came data protection questions about how we transferred employee data around the group, and it's like, no, we don't do that. And then you realise that someone's got a file on their laptop, goes over to the US, opens that up in the US, and all of a sudden you're in a different country opening up information that might have people's personal details in the UK. It's a bloody nightmare. From Long Tall Sally perspective, it's all about documentation and making sure we know what we're doing now, and that's happening now. So whilst people are sorting out what they think we're actually going to really have to do, and hopefully Lara can keep everyone talking sense in that perspective, it's about sorting out what we're doing now, and if there's any big obvious gaps, plugging them while we're waiting for everything to settle down.
Julian? Sorry, Julian, we've given you a minus time here to make it go.
So I'll do this in -1.
Yeah.
Thank you. Julian Berry. I look at this from a technology perspective rather than from a legal perspective. And I think in a nutshell, there are three things. One is a really robust single customer view, so you can not have several versions of Mr. Smith, but you have a single version of Mr. Smith. Secondly, not only holding the individual consent or non-consent statements, but having a sort of decision process on top of that that converts what may be conflicting statements into a set of rules about who you can or cannot communicate with. And thirdly, the need obviously to provide subject access to delete data or to transport data or to amend data, which has to be done easily and quickly in order to comply with the consumer demand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry you haven't had a chance to ask the panel, but as I said, there will be round tables that are put out here, and so they're your victims then. Can I? Well, thank you guys.